Open.
Outspoken.
It's ophthalmology off the grid.
An honest look at controversial topics in the field. I'm Blake Williamson.
I'm Gary Wörtz.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Ophthalmology Off the Grid. In this episode, Dr. Toby Tyson joins our hosts, Drs. Blake Williamson and Gary Wörtz, to provide insights into the lessons he has learned from expanding his practice. Thank you for listening. Support for this podcast comes from Bryn Mawr Communications. BMC produces a number of informative podcast series spanning a variety of topics in ophthalmology. Discover a new show at itube.net/podcasts.
Welcome to another episode of Ophthalmology Off the Grid. We're your hosts, Blake Williamson and Gary Wörtz. And Gary, how are you doing, man? It's been a few weeks since I've talked to you.
Yeah, I've been doing great. This has been a busy summer for all of us. Been a busy meeting schedule, but I'm really excited for this episode in particular. Today, we're talking to our good friend, Dr. Toby Tyson. So Toby, without further ado, thanks for coming on the program today. We've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while because you have so much to teach us, and I'm just excited to hear a little bit more about your story. And, just honestly learn what has made your life as an ophthalmologist what it is today. Toby, why don't you give for the few people out there who might not know, can you give us a little bit of just an overview of your practice, where you're located, how long you've been there, and those sorts of things?
I'm Toby Tyson. I practice in Southwest Florida, so Fort Myers, Cape Coral, Naples area. Actually, second generation ophthalmology, just like Blake. And so part of it is, we're talking about making your brand. I got to grow up watching not just my father's practice and how it was trying to be branded, but also watching all the competition. So when I came back, I had a good idea of what would work, what wouldn't, how did I want to compete in a highly competitive market. And so when I came back, we had one office, one with a surgery center inside it. We were on one side of the river, and at that point in life, pretty much we had a sort of a monopoly for that area, and everybody else was battling it out across the river. And this was before you started having really aggressive marketing. And so that was about 2001 when I came back to the practice. Now we have 9 offices, 2 surgery centers, and 5 MDs with optometry also. So I've had to grow it not because of ego, but because of the economics of the area and how to be able to financially be able to employ the people necessary these days, the people for billing, the ones for making sure that everything's been approved, being able to fight the denials, keeping all our licenses active. You can't do that anymore as a single surgeon very easily, because every time you turn your back, they've changed the contract on you and you have to reapply to whatever insurance flavor of the week is, volume 2, 3, 4, because they know if you can't get on the plan, then you're doing it for free. And so we've learned that you have to have the right personnel in place. So you have to have a certain size to be able to employ that type of people.
And I think that kind of gets to what you're saying, critical mass. It used to be that you could sort of hang a shingle, and with the way reimbursement was, you didn't have to see that many patients or do that many surgeries or be that savvy in business to make a pretty good living. Not to say that those who came before us weren't those things, but the floor was a lot higher in terms of, if you go out there and do a reasonably good job, you're going to be successful. Blake, I'm sure you've experienced this as well, but it seems like you have to almost have or be part of a mega practice to do all the things Toby's talking about. Talk me through what your thoughts on that are, Blake.
Yeah, I think that it is hard to go hang a sign. We've talked about that in previous episodes for those people who do want to do it. Instead, I would just go out and purchase a busy, medically minded optometric practice, like a single optom, who's been in practice 20, 30 years, that would be a great way to start. Starting cold turkey, even for us in our market where we're really well known, is very difficult. And we would plan to lose money for quite a bit before doing that. So I can only imagine just opening up your own place right out of school. I love the idea of being a part of a practice like Toby's, and sort of growing within that. If you're really talented, it's likely that the practice owner will let you sort of buy into the practice and the ASC over time, if they want to keep you, if you're really talented. If not, at least you learn certain skills that you can't learn in residency, and you get to learn them in the real world. And then you might go join a practice that does offer that, if that's a goal of yours. Many of our colleagues frankly don't want to put forth the capital necessary to buy into a very, very busy practice at a high EBITDA. Understandably, they're okay being employed, especially if they're treated right and given autonomy. But I think that it's just different strokes for different folks. And so a practice like Tyson I gives you the opportunity to excel if you want to, and if you're wanting to be more of a role player who's employed and is happy to do so. I'm sure there's a place for you there as well. At least that's how we've done it in our practice.
Well, another thing that you bring up, Blake, is, for the three of us, we kind of came into practices that were established that were heavily dependent on Medicare and the insurances. The other way to look at it is, if you are coming out, you don't necessarily have to play that insurance rule, because you're not trying to feed the beast still. You can start off with more of a boutique premium practice with maybe low volume but high margin, and be very successful going that route also.
I want to ask you about that, Toby. Do you sometimes? I'm sure Gary feels this way. I certainly feel this way. Do you sometimes kind of like have that sort of grass is greener vibe, where it's like after you've just done 35 cataracts in a row, you're like, man, it'd be nice to do like 8 cataracts that are all premium. I'm sure most of your 30 are premium anyway, but I like the idea. Sometimes I think about creating a boutique practice within my larger practice, and that's what I've done. Is I only see certain things, I only see certain surgeries, and I've been able to kind of create that. Have you tried to do that within your practice?
So I cover a fairly large geographic area, and Naples is our newest quote satellite office. And what I look back on is I'm like, my gosh, the conversion rate is so high, the margins are so good. What do I really need? If all I had to have was a check-in / office manager, I wouldn't have to have billers or any of the authorizations team. I could just do purely cash and have 1 or 2 good techs. I really would be able to take home probably the same amount of money with a heck of a lot of less hassle, but that office is helping feed the other satellites that were pre-existing. So as I've gotten older, I've gone down to 4 days a week. I'm pretty much just doing cataracts and surgery. So yes, I have kind of narrowed my focus and let the younger guys do the more esoteric stuff. And that's been very rewarding, and I enjoy having the extra day off. So I do think you can have a smaller boutique practice within a practice.
Yeah, I also think that there's some wisdom. My partner, Lance Ferguson, has mentioned just sort of the idea of having a mutual fund practice where you have multiple revenue sources. You may have, your top revenue source may be your top premium, and that may be really, really great for a long time. But then the economy tanks and you're happy to have the Medicare cataracts. And, not everything has the same profit margin, but also not everything has the same level of risk. And so diversifying your practice a little bit, I think does hedge you a little bit when you don't know what the economy is going to do in 5 years or so.
Well, you saw that with the LASIK. All of a sudden, everybody dropped their cataracts. I'm just going to do LASIK, and then LASIK, the bottom dropped out, and now they're trying to rebuild their cataract practices.
Exactly. So there's some lessons there. I'd love to. So speaking of lessons, one thing we like to talk to all of our guests on and learn from is, and we've been talking about this a little bit organically, but what lessons do you feel like you have learned as you not only grew up in ophthalmology and were a casual observer, but maybe how have things changed? What were some decisions that you made early that were hard that turned out working out well for you, or vice versa, decisions that you wish you would have done differently that you had to learn the hard way? What comes to mind?
Well, when I started expanding, it was nice because it started bringing more volume into the practice. So I was having my own kind of built-in feeder system, because in my market, you had several very large players. So you couldn't outspend them on marketing. You weren't going to out co-manage them because they already pretty much had bought and sold the co-management area. So I would open up a satellite office. I would bring in an optometrist and organically grow my practice that way. But one of the things that I learned is that you really want visibility in your locations. And so a lot of times I would buy old bank buildings because they would be extremely well built. They had a large parking space availability. Their layouts were perfect. Their teller desks were their check-in, check-out. You had all the little offices around the periphery that were great for exam rooms. And then you had a nice big lobby in the center. And of course, they were always on the ideal corners in your community. So they had a high visibility. And I found very quickly that it was better to pay mortgage and have about 18% of my patients tell me that they came to the practice because they saw the building, versus paying for a TV or radio ad that the moment it was gone. And you had to generate so many cataracts off of that one ad just to pay for itself. As I was expanding, I tried having offices in strip malls next to the grocery store, and you think that these would be high flow, high traffic areas, but very quickly you realize that you're paying the CAM for the big grocery store. They're not paying any CAM. So you've got a high rent rate, and everybody's going straight to the grocery store. They're getting the groceries and they're leaving, and they're never going by your place. They're never looking at you. And the other thing is the perception by the patients is, oh, they're not successful. They're just working out of a small office. So it was better for me to acquire a 4,000 to 7,000 square foot commercial building on a main drag. And then you ask, well, how do you feed that place right off the bat? This is where I used more of a dispersive model of my administration. So if I opened up a new office, I'd move, let's say, billing out there. Instead of having a centralized administration, I would actually start sprinkling administration on to all the different offices because I had that excess space. Now, as I've gotten busier and now I need all that space for clinic, it allows me to go open up another office and move more of the administration out there and leave the other one purely clinical. But it was a good way to utilize space that you were paying rent for, but give the perception that you were much more successful than you actually were at that time point.
Interesting. So you gave yourself space to grow into because you had a decentralized service taking up that space until it was needed elsewhere. Until you needed that space, you could decentralize it and put it somewhere else. That's really interesting. Yeah. Now, in your model, do you have optical? Do you have full service ophthalmology, optometry? Do you focus more on the surgical aspects, cataract refractive? Talk to us about your model and how it works.
So we have full service optometry. Our optometrists are not super techs. They have practices within the practice. When I put them out at a satellite office, that is their office. I do not rotate them around. I do not rotate around the opticians or the techs because I want the patients to feel like that's their home, that they trust those individuals, that they recognize them. So when it does come time for cataract surgery and they say, you need cataracts, we're going to set you up with Dr. Tyson, they don't go down the street and shop someplace else because they have no association for the practice. And that's worked real well. Meanwhile, the reason I did that is I was watching other ophthalmologists in my market that had multiple satellites. They would rotate all their staff around because they were so scared that those doctors would actually build a clientele and then open up right down the street. And I think as long as you keep your staff, happy in the practice, both financially and professionally, then it's a win-win for everybody, and they're not going to leave you. So I do have opticals in all but one of the offices, and I'm kind of at that point where it's gotten tougher and tougher. It used to be a great profit center. So when we would first start off a new office, I'd open up the office, I would put in a optician and an optometrist. The optician would also work the front desk and do check in, check out, and they could do the optical, and they would make enough money in optical that they would subsidize the optometrist who wasn't seeing enough patients right off the bat. By the next year, now it was time to go ahead and bring in a technician, maybe a front desk person, and the optical shop was still generating very well, but now the optometrist was covering himself, and I could continue to expand that practice slowly but organically. And that's because optical was pretty much fairly retail and made good money. Later in Florida, what's happened is the insurance companies have realized that we make money on optical. So they came in and said, well, if you want to keep your medical patients with us, you're going to have to be on our optical plan, and you're going to have to use our frames, our lens lab, and our lenses, and we'll give you $15 to dispense. Well, you can't pay a licensed optician $15 to dispense a pair of glasses because of the amount of time it takes to check in, check out, make the order. So now I'm sitting there looking at it. When I went into Naples, I purposely did not put in an optical shop because I didn't want to have to pay for all that overhead that was involved, the rent on that space that was being used, having to staff the frame board on frames that I wasn't allowed to really sell anyways, and then paying for a licensed optician. It was just easier to not have it and say, oh, I'm so sorry, we don't have optical here. So now the question is, do I start divesting out of optical because that real estate is more valuable, seeing patients for, frankly, cataract surgery? At one point, we even had audiology in the practice, and it was making money, but you quickly learned that it was a different message than the rest of the practice. And the amount of revenue that you were creating once you needed that space. Eventually, when you first put it in, it was just, okay, I've got excess capacity. This is an overhead reducer. At a certain point, you start saying, well, shoot, I can bring in retina, and that is going to generate much better profit margin than audiology for the same space. And it's kind of more in our market. So at one point, we divested out of audiology, brought in retina. Now, I think it's very market dependent, but I think optical can be a winner, but it can also be a break even or a loss leader.
Interesting.
It's funny listening to this, like our practices are just identical in every single way. I mean, the same number of locations, the same model with optoms at every location. They're there, 4 to 5 days a week. It's not like they're there a half day a week and they call it a satellite location. They're actually there. We had audiology, now we don't. We're heavy on optical. Now it's there has been some nuance and changes there. One thing that we've done in that space is actually sold optical to our optometrists, and so that's been a wonderful way to kind of bring them on as a partner, giving them some ownership of Williamson Eye Center. Is that some of them who've shown interest in that have been able to buy in or take over the optical, because it kind of we're like, honestly, that's more your space anyway. You're probably going to do a better job of running that, and it's when it affects your bottom line. So that's been kind of a way for us to sort of get out of optical, but still kind of stay in it. We love the opportunity to kind of bring people in for eye care, eyewear, and eye surgery, and kind of be like Gandhi, a river to your people. You kind of sell everything, so it's vertically integrated, and so that's been our model. It's just the exact same. Toby, what I'd love to hear is kind of how you jump from 1 to 8 or 9 practices. Did you do it strategically by gobbling up and buying other practices, kind of like your own PE, or did you flat out just hang a sign in a new location? Because I'm trying to figure out right now in my market, how do I go from local to regional? We're at 8 locations. We have an opportunity to do another one that's going to make us more regional, and I'm trying to figure out how I can best do that.
And one nuance to that also, how did you do the calculation to know it was likely going to be a winner? I think that's a different. So yeah.
So part of it was, is it in a geographical area that it can get back to feed the surgery center? I watched the guys that used to be in the 1980s have their surgery center, and they had 31 satellite offices feeding it from as far away as an hour and a half. And then you started watching their wheel and hub and spoke model start to break down because that area finally got busy enough that a local guy comes in, builds his own surgery center, and now you've got to amputate that spoke off. And you're just watching these large practices having to continue to shrink and shrink down. And the problem is their infrastructure was built for volume. And so as you started losing the volume, the finances didn't make sense. So first off, I needed to make sure that this was in a zone that the patients could get back to our surgery center. When I first started off, I went to an area that had 18 golf course communities around it, and there was no ophthalmologist. And I didn't care the fact that everybody thought that socioeconomically it wasn't the best place. You were watching everybody kind of laugh and go, oh, well, some of those golf course communities have trailer parks in them. And I go, it doesn't matter. Medicare pays the same amount of money, whether it's there or in Naples, where people are living in $15 million homes. And this was before premium lenses. So then I tried that one for the first one, and that worked very well. And it was start from scratch, just slowly build it up. And when I figured that out, the next year I said, well, let's open up 2 more. Because if I could do 1, why can't you do 2? That's when I learned the lesson that cash flow has a very important part. So yes, you could go out there and get the leases or buy the buildings and do this stuff, but now you're getting a cash flow crunch because you're just not generating the revenue. You could absorb a little bit of loss on 1 while it's growing, but absorbing the loss on 2, which was much more difficult. So I learned never to do 2 in a year. And then I got to about 5 offices and I just kind of settled out. Then we had the recession come through. And this is where you've got to be somewhat nimble in your practice, and you have to be able to swallow your pride, because I really didn't want to close office buildings because I didn't want it to give the perception that, something was wrong with the practice or something. But when the recession came through, they started changing around the way that they would, the insurance companies would deal with us. And they said, since I don't have any offices on the other side of the bridge in Fort Myers, that they were going to kick me off the plans. And I was like, I'm the only full service ophthalmology practice on the north side of the river. Cape Coral is the 2nd largest land city in the state. And I'm the only one that has a surgery center over here. I'm full service. They go, we don't care. So I had to migrate south. In the meantime, Obamacare was coming through, where they were now starting to have all these different managed care programs, and people were buying high deductible, didn't want to come in. And what I found is when I closed one of my least producing offices on the north of the river, migrated south, and that was a more affluent area. This is where I found that I could see less patients and drive more revenue. And so now I started looking at it a little bit differently. The next one I did, this is where you're getting into building it yourself or acquiring it. I acquired a practice because an optometrist came to me and she said, hey, I want to sell my practice. And I looked at it and I really didn't like the idea of buying a practice, because I know a lot of times the culture doesn't necessarily jive, but it was a freestanding building right on the main drag in a section of town that I wanted to be in. She owned the practice outright. She owned the building outright. So I negotiated with her a owner financing on the main building. I got it at 3% interest on a 30-year amortization on a 5-year balloon. So I didn't have to come out of pocket for almost anything on the building to start with. Then I was able to convince her that if I was to buy out the practice, that I would only pay 50% of it up front, and that she had to work out the back end of it to keep her around for 6 more months. So my initial outlay was very minimal. Also, I did it as a asset purchase. And it just so happened that they extended the Section 179 and made it large enough that I was able to write off the whole acquisition of the practice as an asset purchase and write it all off as an expense. So that worked out really good. The problem was, within a year and a half, every single employee that was in that practice was gone. We at least generated enough cataracts out of there to easily pay it off very quickly and get out from under the 5-year balloon with her and stuff. But it was almost a turnover in patients also, because the patients that were going there, well, Dr. So-and-so never made me pay for the refraction, or I never had to do this. And well, I'm going to go someplace else. So I found it to be, if it wasn't for the fact that I was getting a physical building and property that I wanted at a good deal, I don't know if it would have been ideal to have bought out the practice, because I pretty much had to rebuild it after about a year and a half.
And I'll jump in real quick there, Toby, just to give you our perspective. Like, we expect exactly that, because you're exactly right. That's what's happened. 2 or 3 times that we've done this recently. We expect to lose every employee literally within a few months, because when Williamson I comes in, we are actually going to work. We're going to see patients. We're going to be delivering state-of-the-art care. It's really important. And to your point, a lot of those mom and pop, smaller, single-owned OD practices just kind of don't have that mindset. So what we think of, we're buying the charts. We're literally buying the diabetics and the glaucoma charts. That's what we want, is 20 plus years of charts. We expect the OD to not be there. In fact, we prefer that, because we want to install our culture as soon as possible, Gary. So it's like one of those things where we just plan for that, and because Toby's exactly right.
It was given to us kind of as a slur, but we've kind of taken it as a badge of honor. And our unofficial motto is Tyson Eye is not for everyone. And that's because we hold all our staff to a higher standard. We expect continual education. We have a certain professionalism, and that, you're right. When your practice goes and acquires it, you're bringing in a culture that usually the people that are working at the place that you acquired are working there because they didn't feel comfortable working in an environment such as yours.
Right. So while we've got a few minutes left before we end this, I want to talk a little bit about recruiting new docs. Toby, I don't think anyone has been as successful as you at recruiting top talent with Dave Stevens and Christos Ifantides. So what is the secret? What is the secret to attracting top young talent? Because I'm jealous, frankly, that you have such great partners working with you.
He gives them Ferraris. He gives them all Ferraris, is what they
That's
get.
good.
Well, a couple things. First off, in my market, I watch my big competitors just seem to churn doctors. They'd bring them in 3 years later. They weren't allowed to buy in. They moved along, and they just flooded my market with extra docs. And what I noticed was some of these docs seem to have such a big ego that they couldn't bring it upon themselves to bring somebody in that was just as good, if not better, and allow them to have some of the spotlight. And so when I was looking at this, I go, what type of practice do I want to build? I don't want it just to be the Toby Tyson and cast. I go, I want to have something. And I honestly, I look at what Dick Lindstrom has done there, how Cincinnati Eye has done, where they went out and, growing up, I'm sitting there watching, okay, here's Dick, here's Harden, you've got everybody there is top shelf on the podium doing research. And I go, that's what I would really like to have. And to me, that's more important than necessarily how much money I take home at the end of the day. So first off, what is your view? For me, it was quality. Second, how do I go out and get it? And so don't be in a hurry. Figure, where do you need to be? When do you need to do it? Acquire talent when it's available. And so I started calling around all my friends at the different teaching institutions, and I'll go, hey, you got anything good? No, you don't want this one. Or, yeah, this one's great, but they don't want to go to Florida. And, I just was taking my time looking to find that winner. And the hardest part's getting the first one. So when I was able to recruit Dr. Stevens, he was at Vance Thompson Eye with John Berdahl. And, I was talking with them at one of the meetings, and they're like, hey, we actually got somebody who doesn't want to stay up here. He's originally from Oklahoma. Don't think he has any interest in Florida. And so got in touch with him and really tried to explain to him the value proposition that, we have a wonderful area to practice. It's a great place to raise kids. It's not the big city. So that's the downside that a lot of people want. But I go, in the long term, it's going to be better. And they're like, well, what do you pay? And I go, well, I've got 3 options: a small salary, big bonus, medium salary, medium bonus, or big salary, no bonus. And, he's like, well, I'd want the small salary, big bonus, because I believe in myself. And I'm like, okay, bam, we're on the right track. It kind of self eliminates for you. So I knew I had somebody that had the drive to grow their practice, but also had the belief in themselves. I knew they had good hands, but also, do they have the people skills, and do they have the ethics and culture? And that's the harder thing. And so that's where you're looking at who have they worked with, what type of feedback do you get from them, what type of feedback do you get back from the reps out there. Then it comes down to having the conversation about the contract. And this is where, I always tell them, I go, there's two important things in life, and you better get them right the first go round. One is who you marry, and the second one is who do you work with? I go, because you don't want to do either one of them over again. It's very, very costly. And I go, both of them have about a 50% success rate on the first go round. And I go, I'm going to tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly. I go, I'm sure you're going to interview other places. They're going to cherry code it. And, I'm going to sit there and I'm going to show you the numbers. And at the time with David, I go, look, here's where I'm at. I'm at a high overhead because I've got all these facilities and stuff. And I go, if you tell me you want to buy in right now, there's really no pot of gold behind the curtain. I go, but this is where I see it coming. If I bring you on board and we get you busy, I go, everything else is already covered and paid for. I go, that's going to drive the overhead down and it's going to be financially worthwhile. And one of the fears was, well, are you going to sell out to PE? And I go, I have no interest in it. It doesn't make sense for me. I go, but I'm happy to write into the contract that if I was to sell out to PE, you could immediately vest. That way you don't get screwed over.
Right.
And so that allayed those fears. And so once he came on board, very quickly, he got busy. I did not try to hoard cataracts. I didn't say you couldn't do premium lenses. What I actually did is I said, here, I'm going to have you go to this office and I'll stop going to that office. I'm going to let you go to this office. I'm going to stop going there. That way we're not fighting for cataracts. You can build your practice within the practice. We're going to have, equal face time in the marketing. And so you're not second fiddle, because ideally I want you to grow. If you grow, it's better for me. This, of course, all happened within 2020 with COVID. But even though we were shut down for 6 weeks, all this other stuff would happen, the practice grew. Both of us, my cataract volume didn't fall off. It actually grew, and it was additional to him. He was able to buy in after 3 years. And so in the meantime, he calls me up and says, hey, I was talking with Christos. So you're asking, how am I recruiting? Well, actually, the person I recruited was helping recruit. And he goes, what do you think of this? And I go, well, I think it's a great opportunity. This is a very skilled individual. I go, this is not on our timeline because you're not fully busy yet. I go, but, I do believe in acquiring talent when we can figure out how to make it work. I go, but you need to go home and talk with your wife. And he goes, why would I do that? And I go, because if we bring in somebody else, I go, probably it's not going to cut into my take home because my name's on the building and I've been around a while. It's probably going to eat into your cataracts a little bit. And you need to have her understand why the money might fall off a little bit. And he came back a week later, to his credit, and said, we had the talk. We think it's best to bring in quality while we can. So we brought him in, and it did not cut into his cataracts. It was additive. It once again was able to help lower the overhead. So it's been a very good thing. And now what I'm finding is, with the two of them out there now, very happy in the practice, I'm getting lots of people that are, well-known individuals on the speaking circuit that are at that same age group, but they got into practices that may not be fulfilling their needs. And now they're saying, hey, you got room for another. And I'm sitting there going, okay, guys, now how do we bring in another one? Because you don't want to miss out on it. But at the same time, you don't want to just build to be big. You want to make sure it's all cohesive.
Right. There's an old saying that A's hire A's and B's hire C's. And I think that this is case in point, that when you're confident in yourself, you're not afraid of hiring someone who can be as good or better. It doesn't threaten you. As a matter of fact, it's part of your culture of what you want to do. Blake, I feel like this has to be part A, and for a to be continued episode. Toby, would you be willing to come on maybe in the future? Maybe we can do another set of question and answer. I'm loving this, and I'm learning so much.
Well, I love the format, because you normally you can't put all these little stories or vignettes into an article. And so this is a great way to do it, because all of these things have a little moral or pearl that's inside there that you can take, because a lot of it is, like you said, what did you do right and what did you do wrong, and how could you have avoided it? And there's a lot of those things that you're sitting there going, okay, I learned from it. Now, if somebody else can learn from it, then they skip stumbling.
Exactly. And that's what makes us all better. Blake, any final comments?
No, just appreciate the time, Dr. Tyson, and it's been great to watch how you've grown this business and kind of took something that your dad started and kind of blew it up and has grown and grown, and it's bigger than ever. So yeah, I look forward
I've
to round
enjoyed
two.
watching both of y'all become so successful. So it's fun to have friends in industry.
It absolutely is. And Toby, I'm sure I'll see you at Parents Weekend at Wake Forest. Our kids are going to college together, and it's been fun to get to know you a little bit more socially too. So yeah, until next time.
Thank you. Y'all have a great night.
This has been another episode of Ophthalmology Off the Grid. Thank you to our guest, Dr. Toby Tyson, for speaking with Drs. Blake Williamson and Gary Wörtz and sharing insights into strategies to successfully expand a practice.